So in our last class, we talked about the kinds of reproduction algae undergo, and we said that the acronym for that reproduction is PFS, BSF rather. So, and we said that B represents binary fusion, S spore formation, and the last one is fragmentation. Now, in this class, we'll be focusing on classification of algae. And we said that classification of algae is given an acronym SIP my red blood cell, where C represents chlorophyceae, E represents echinophyceae, P represents Phyophyceae, M represents Mesophyceae, Phyceae rather. Then R represents Rhodophyceae. We have B representing Bacillophyceae, and the last one, which is Cyanophyceae. Now note that Mesophyceae, which is My, and Cyanophyceae are the same, right? So is that you call it Mesophyceae or you call it Cyanophyceae? These are the six, because if you eventually add Cyanophyceae to it and you differentiate it from Mesophyceae, you're going to get seven, right? But another name for Cyanophyceae is Mesophyceae, or what we call blue-green algae. So we're taking the six classes now, right? The first being Chlorophyceae. Chlorophyceae talks about the green algae. Now, this Chlorophyceae, the class is further divided into six order. Now, take note of something. There's something we call botanical classification of living things. Now, this botanical classification of living things has a particular acronym called COF, KP-COF-GS. The K means kingdom, and P means phylum. It means phylum for animals, but in plants, we call it division. Okay. Then we have C, which means class. And then we have O, which means order. Then we have F, which means family. And last and second one was last, we have genus. And the last is species. Now, which means that if I'm dealing with botanical classification, I can start with having kingdom. So the plants we're dealing with now, which are the algae, fall under kingdom Plantae. Does that make sense? Now, we've mentioned earlier that there are other several kingdoms, which we said that we have kingdom Animalia. Then the second is Plantae, right, which is the plant kingdom. The next is Protista. We talked about Monera, and we talked about fungi. Then we talked about the last one, which is viruses, right? And we said viruses cannot be classified under the kingdoms because it possesses dual nature, or it exists in two ways, which is as non-living or as non as living. Now, once I pick the kingdom Plantae, I can talk about the phylum, that what I am actually talking about, which is the algae that I'm talking about. Which phylum does this belong to? Here, we cannot really say they belong to a phylum because phylum is usually used for animals. Then we can talk about which division do they belong. Then we know that they are cryptograms. Now, this class is where we are now. Classes, or the class that algae belongs to, right? And we now said that there are six classes in total. Does that make sense? And we said we have Chlorophyceae, Glenophyceae, Phyophyceae, Mesophyceae, or what you call Cyanophyceae. Then you have Rhodophyceae and Bacillophyceae. That makes sense. Now, once you pick a class, you can further divide it into order. So for Chlorophyceae that we're dealing with, which is number one now, under the classes of algae, Chlorophyceae possess six other orders. That is, if we divide Chlorophyceae further, we're going to get six orders, right? Six other orders. Okay, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, then the sixth one here. Does that make sense? So these are how we classify the orders of Chlorophyceae. So, but before we go to the order, let's talk about the next class, which is Iglenophyceae. The major example under the Iglenophyceae is the Iglena. So the third class, which is the Phyophyceae. Phyophyceae are also known as the brown algae. Example is Laminaria. We have Sargassum, we have Ectocoppus, and we have Fucus. Right, these are the examples of the Phyophyceae, and we will see how they or we got to know that these examples should fall under this class. Okay. Now we have the next one, which is the fourth class. That's the Mesophyceae. Mesophyceae, or what we call Cyanophyceae, are the blue-green algae. Example is your nostoc. So sometimes when you check in some textbook, if they want to call the name for nostoc, or if they want to give nostoc another name, they will call it blue-green algae, right? It is because it's an example or it falls under the blue-green algae. Now we have the next one, which is Anabina, and we have Oscillatoria. Right, the next class is Rhodophyceae. Rhodophyceae are the red algae, okay? And we have Polysiphonia as a major example of Rhodophyceae. Then we have the next, which is Bacillariophyceae, or what you call Chrysophyceae. That is, they have another name, which is called Chrysophyceae. Now, they are also known as glassy brown algae. Do you understand? All right, example is diatoms. Don't forget that I told you that there are six classes of algae, which Bacillariophyceae is the last one. Now, writing the seventh class here does not really matter. It's just for us to complete the acronym, which is still Chlorophyceae. Note that the Chlorophyceae has the longest order of all the classes. Don't forget or recall that I told you that when we split each class into further division, we're going to have order. So splitting Chlorophyceae has one of the class into further order. We are going to have Vicissox. Okay, the V represents Vovocals. The next is Chlorococals. The next, which is S, represents Siphonals. And the next is Lotricals. And the next is Conjugals. And the last is Clodophorals. Now, I expect that you pronounce these words after me so we can learn alongside how to pronounce these words. Okay, so we have Vicissox. The first thing I pronounce is Vovocals from the word Vovox. Okay, so and that's why we have the major example, a major member under Vovocals as Vovox. Then the next one is Chlorococals. We have the next one, Siphonals. Okay, the next is Ulotricals. Okay, the next we have is the conjugals. Conjugals, in other words, they kind of undergo conjugation. Then the next is clodophorals. Clodophorals. All right, these are the six classes. Now, this last one does not really matter because there is nothing there. Now, this one makes number one. This is two. This is three. Okay, this is four. This is five. And this is six, which makes it six classification in total. So which means that this S is just for us to complete the acronym so that it can sound well, which is VCSOPs. All right. On this note, we'll be moving directly to the examples of each of this order. Now, as a student, what are you expected to know here? First, you must realize that algae has six classes, and this six classes was given an acronym, which is SIP my red blood cell. Now, inside the SIP, we have CEP. C means chlorophyceae, E means iglenophyceae, P means phyophyceae. Then we have mine. Mine means mesophyceae. Then red blood cell, RBC. R means rhodophyceae, B means bacillariophyceae, and the last C is working with MY. Now, the next thing you must know is that if an examiner asks you to give an example of chlorophyceae, what are you going to do? You can pick an example from Vovocals, which is Vovox. You can decide to pick an example from Ulotricals, which is Ulotrix. You can decide to pick an example from Conjugals, which is Spirogyra. You can pick an example just to make examples of chlorophyceae. But if the examiner asks you to list the order and the examples, then you have to list it, then give examples of each of the order that you have there. That makes sense, right? Then I have the next one, which is Iglenophyceae. I know the major example from the word Iglena. I know Iglena belongs to Iglenophyceae. Then I have the Phyophyceae. The 556 is telling you the brown algae, and you can have several examples under that too. Then we have mesophyceae, where we have no stock. So at home tutorials, for instance, all students are advised, if not compelled, to learn the examples of each of these orders. For instance, if I ask a student to give me example of Chlorophyceae, which is a class, then the student can just pick at random in this order, the examples of this order. So by telling me, oh, Volvox, Ulutrix, Zygonema, this and that. Then I can also ask a student to give me examples of sulfonals. Oh, the student is to tell me, oh, Vuchereria clauleria. Now, if a student is asked to give me examples of conjugals, the students should also remember that we have Zygonema and Spirogyra. Okay, so let me teach you quickly how to easily remember these examples. If I pick the first order, which is first order under the class Chlorophyceae, I have vovocals. Nobody needs to tell me that because the word sounds like vovox, vovox is part of the example. So the only problem you'll be having is to remember Pandorina and Idorina. But once you remember Pandorina, since it's having the same ending, then you should be able to remember Idorina as an example of vovocals. Now, chlorococals, then we have chlorococum and chlorella. All right, this chlorella is a very useful product in the production of I think antibiotics also. Okay, then we have siphonals. Siphonal example is Vaucheria cowleria. Then we have ulotricals. We have an example of electrical as ulotrix. Then conjugals. So for you to remember conjugals, you should think about conjugation. Okay, conjugation is more like talking about two things really coming together. Do you understand? So, and when two things come together, like um in fertilization, for instance, it forms a zygote. Okay. So when you remember the word, um, when you remember that idea, two things coming together to conjugate, do you understand? Then you should think about zygotes, right? Then you have the example of zygonema. Now, an example of a microorganism that undergo conjugation has a method of reproduction is actually Spirogyra. So Spirogyra undergo conjugation. That makes sense, right? Then we have the last one, which is chlorophorals. For chlorophoral, example is Pittophora, right? It sounds like it's Pittophora, and we have Cladophora. These are the two major examples as far as cladophorals are concerned. So we have a problem for you to solve. And the problem is study, right? But then in our next video, maybe I'll bring some past questions for us to deal with. Enjoy the rest of your day and see you in the next one.